Hello, I'm Imran Garda. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, our weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, as China snaps at the heels of the United States, we meet the economist who says America is bankrupt. Former powerhouses stand bare, leaving more than 1 million unemployed. We ask how many more knocks Africa's second biggest economy can take. And the airline that could be grounded as pilots quit for better work elsewhere. Now, the answer to the global economic recession was almost unified. Throw billions and billions of dollars at the economy. It worked. As Western nations pile up the debt, the debate within economic circles is getting heated. Heated because there is uncertainty of the sustainability of growth. Samar Shihat is in our London broadcast centre.
Thanks. That debate, as you say, is indeed heated. On the one hand, you have Keynesian economists who believe that for the economy to truly recover, it needs more help and money from the government. On the other hand, you have austerity hawks who say governments must slash their debt or face a Greek-style crisis. Credit rating agency Moody's says that Western nations need to get their debts under control or lose their AAA ratings. But with aging populations and huge bills to pay in the future, it's not an easy task for those big Western economies. Matthew Moore gives an insight into this by taking a snapshot of the global economy right now and looks at where growth may come from.
It's still the biggest economy in the world, worth as much as China, Japan and Germany combined. But its recovery from the worst downturn since the Great Depression has hit a roadblock. The Federal Reserve believes US growth is at risk and is spending billions to avert a double-dip recession, whereas China's growth looks assured, overtaking sluggish Japan in the second quarter. In fact, China's problem is cooling an overheating economy, in particular slowing a booming housing market before it crashes. Chinese officials are introducing a number of measures, including a ban on third mortgages. They'd better work for the sake of economies around the world. Meanwhile, China's great exporting rival Germany has posted its strongest rise in GDP since reunification. But as with all export-led recoveries, its future depends on the rest of the world being able to afford its goods. So, a mixed picture for the Big Four, but there are a number of up-and-coming economies to keep an eye on. The Goldman Sachs economist Jim O'Neill, who famously coined the term BRIC a few years ago to highlight the successes of Brazil, Russia, India and China, has come up with a new list, the Next 11. This group is led by Indonesia and Turkey. Indonesia's economy expanded at 4% throughout the global recession, and its president is now targeting 7.7% by 2014. Indonesia's $540 billion economy may grow 6% this year, helped by rising consumer spending by its 240 million people. The nations on O'Neill's Next 11 have huge populations, and turning these people into consumers is the challenge.
It's the consumer that has helped the United States maintain its lead as the world's biggest economy, accounting for around 75% of economic activity. The map shows that in January 2007, unemployment was at 4.6%. The dark areas show states where unemployment was around 6%. In June 2010, national unemployment stood at 9.7%. But look at the dark areas there. Unemployment is above 10%. And as a result, some of these consumers are having a tough time. So much so that America's recovery from the financial crash has been brought into question. Over the longer term, the US is dealing with an aging population, rising social security costs and healthcare costs, and with those daunting burdens in mind, some are going as far as to say the US is bankrupt.
So, is this the end of the road for America, or has it learned enough lessons from the financial crisis to set it on the road to economic recovery and prosperity? Joining me to discuss this is Lawrence Kotlikoff, Professor of Economics at Boston University. Professor Kotlikoff, thank you so much for joining me. Tell me, there's a great deal of confusion about the state of America's economy. On the one hand, you have got Timothy Geithner, US Treasury Secretary, saying that the American economy is on the road to recovery. But on the other hand, you have people saying that America is in a depression. So which is it?
I think it's both. I think there's some evidence that things are recovering, and there's some evidence that things are stagnating. We certainly have a lot of unemployed people, something like 15 million unemployed people, and for them there's been no recovery. So we have a difficult road to hoe to get back to where we should be.
Do you think then the government should be spending more money to stimulate the economy, or should it be slashing spending right now?
Well, we have to be very careful about any more spending because we really need to cut spending, I think, dramatically to deal with our long-term fiscal problems. We can't keep waiting every year to say, oh, well, we'll deal with these long-term problems in the future, because those long-term problems are just getting bigger and bigger with that kind of a policy. So we have to get our fiscal house in order. And I think if you look at the long-run projections of the International Monetary Fund for the U.S. or the Congressional Budget Office, you see a very dire picture. You see a picture really of government bankruptcy. And I don't say that lightly. The level of expenditures that are being projected for Medicare and Medicaid, which are our two federal health care programs, and we've now just added a third with the new health legislation, those expenditures are enormous, and they're very large, partly because benefit levels have been growing so rapidly in recent years and are projected to continue to rise, and we have no control apparently over those benefit levels. And also because of the baby boom generations, very large in number, about 78 million people will be starting to retire more and more in the coming decades. So the two things together are a lethal package, fiscally speaking.
But Professor Kotlikov, why isn't the market or the financial markets reflecting this notion that America could be bankrupt?
Well, the bond traders seem to be focused on official debt as a share of GDP. And from that perspective, it's not that large a problem for the U.S. But we have this unofficial debt. We've made sure to label our Social Security and our Medicare and Medicaid programs and other programs in a way that keeps all this unofficial debt, all these liabilities to pay off these benefits, off the books. So it's really very much like Enron accounting. The bond trader, yeah, the government's really taught Enron and Wall Street how to do accounting so that nobody can actually see the truth. The truth is we have about a $202 trillion fiscal gap. That's the present value of all the spending that's projected, including servicing the official debt, minus the present value of all the taxes that we expect to collect. That's about a $202 trillion fiscal gap, according to the Congressional Budget Office. So now, that's huge compared to the roughly $9 trillion debt, official debt. So the real problem is $202 trillion. We're focused on a $9 trillion problem, and that's why the bond traders have this very, very wrong. I would not be buying long-term U.S. Treasury bonds at this point if I had any brains in my head. So
are the Chinese wrong to be doing so?
I think the Chinese are very nervous. Yeah, the Chinese are. I think anybody who's buying long-term bonds, whether they're U.S. Treasury bonds or corporate bonds at low interest rate yields, when we have the potential for very significant inflation, because the only way I think the federal government will be able to pay for these bills is to print lots and lots of money over time, unless we get serious about fixing our problems. And we need to have fundamental structural reforms, and very simple ones, to get the economy rolling again. We can get out of this, but it's going to take some real initiatives that don't involve 2,000-page solutions.
So what kind of reforms?
Very simple, so the public understands, the world understands.
What would these reforms look like?
Sorry, go ahead. Well, take the healthcare system. We're spending about 17% of GDP as a nation on healthcare, and that's the federal share might be 10, 11%, but it's slated to rise dramatically over time, maybe to about 16% or 17% of GDP, which is just unaffordable for the federal government. So what about an alternative, which is to spend just 10% of GDP through time? And the way you do that, that's what Switzerland spends on all of healthcare, as I understand it. The way you do that is you give everybody an individual voucher each year to buy a health policy. And that voucher is larger if you've got a pre-existing health and medical condition. And then you have a government panel that determines what is covered by this basic policy so that the total voucher expenditure doesn't exceed 10% of GDP. And you make sure that panel keeps the expenditure to 10% of GDP every year in the future. That right there will slice off about half of our fiscal gap. That'll save us hundreds of trillions of dollars, maybe $100 trillion. So we need to do that. That's not what we're doing. It's very simple. I didn't need 2,000 pages to describe that solution.
Okay, let me ask you one final question right now. We've just seen that China has overtaken Japan to be the world's second largest economy. Do you think that growth is sustainable, or do you think it will go down the way of Japan?
Well, all these economies are interdependent. So the U.S. is very important for China. China is very important for the U.S. So I think China can continue to grow. I think they will reach developed world standards. At that point, if you go out to 2050, the U.S. will be to China as Canada is today to the U.S. That's the situation. So I'm hopeful that China will continue to develop. And not that I want the U.S. to be relatively small in size, but we want the Chinese, it's a very big country. We want them to have a good standard of living as well.
Professor Kotlikov, thank you so much for joining me today.
When counting the cost returns, Nigeria's textile industry stripped bare as overseas competition encroaches. Plus, Philippine Airlines and its passengers are left to ask, where are the pilots? Welcome back to Counting the Cost, your one-stop shop for business and finance. To Nigeria now, and the threat to a once thriving industry. Fierce competition from Asia has stripped the local textile trade of its luster, leaving more than 1 million people out of work. And that's a modest estimate. So, is a multi-million-dollar bailout too little too late? Businesses in Lagos seem to think so. Emeka Umolu has more.
To the outsider, it looks like business as usual. But many of these textile dealers are facing an uncertain future. A once booming local industry in traditional fabrics is in danger of going bust. It prompted the government to take an unprecedented step late last year, pledging a $6 million bailout package in the form of business loans. Months later, many struggling traders say delivery of those loans is too slow.
8 of our members had got the loan, but there are a lot of them applications approved, which are not being disbursed.
The Rescue Fund is meant to revive what was once Africa's third largest textile industry and Nigeria's largest private provider of jobs. In 1996, it directly employed about 250,000 people. That's now been slashed to 1/10 of what it once was, 25,000. This is now a common sight. Factories that used to heave with activity round the clock lie abandoned. Owners say cheap counterfeit textiles from China and India are flooding the market, leaving them unable to compete. Compounding the problem, poor infrastructure, regular power cuts and high running costs. The knock-on effect is staggering. The industry's main workers' union has told Counting the Cost another 1 million indirect jobs have also been shed. How long Nigerian-run textile factories and stalls stay in operation may now depend on how effective the bailout plan proves to be.
Ailing manufacturing is just one of a series of blows dealt to Nigeria's economy of late. There's also an ongoing banking crisis, uncertainty about upcoming elections, and the problem that just won't go away: attacks in the oil-rich Niger Delta. After a lull, Royal Dutch Shell says sabotage on its pipelines is on the up, with 3 this month alone. Suspected crude thieves cut into pipelines linking Cawthorne Channel to Bonny Island in Rivers State. The oil giant is warning it may not be able to meet contractual obligations as a result. Oil theft, also known as bunkering, coupled with attacks by rebels, is costing Nigeria about $1 billion a month in lost revenue. At one point, the OPEC members saw output slashed by almost 1/3. Joining me from London is Razia Khan, Head of Africa Research at Standard Chartered Bank. Thanks for joining us, Razia. Let's try and take stock of the Nigerian economy in little chunks for now. First of all, this textile industry bailout, is it too little too late?
Well, the problem which a lot of the different sectors, especially manufacturing and textiles perhaps, have faced in Nigeria is just the availability of the infrastructure that might support diversification of the economy away from oil. We all know that there have been huge problems with the infrastructure, whether it's the availability of fuel at the subsidized price, or more importantly, the availability of power. And these are things that plague many different sectors that have had an impact on overall economic performance. Now, the reason why we don't see that necessarily in the GDP growth rates is because even though oil makes up a fairly negligible amount of total GDP, down to about 15% at some stage last year, what we have seen in terms of the recovery of oil prices, oil output, is still sufficient to be keeping GDP relatively elevated. Of course, Nigeria could be doing that much better if some of these infrastructural issues were resolved.
Now, the stock exchange chief was fired recently, and conventional wisdom is that there is most definitely a banking crisis. Is there a crisis? Is that how you would characterize it?
Well, perhaps a year ago, it was discovered that there had been huge losses made at some systemically important banks in Nigeria, and they hadn't really opened up about those losses. Following an audit directed by the regulatory authorities, these losses, the scale of them was discovered. Those institutions, about 10 of them in total, were found to be undercapitalized, and the regulators stepped in, changing the management of those banks, putting in the required liquidity support, putting in place interbank guarantees as well, things that basically kept the banking sector going. Now, a year on, we are moving closer to a period of resolution of Nigeria's banking sector crisis. What we have seen is, because of the benefits of the regulatory support, there hasn't been any outright bank failure. No depositor in Nigeria has lost money in that banking crisis, despite the fact that the banks that were impacted accounted for as much as 30% of the total deposits in the system. So Nigeria has had some success, certainly, in terms of how it's managed to deal with those problems in its banking sector at, one should emphasize, a very limited fiscal cost as well.
Now, the country intends to borrow money to fund the upcoming elections, yet the government has approved 3 new presidential jets worth $150 million. Does that encapsulate the underlying contradictions that plague Nigeria's economy?
Well, there is, of course, this big concern about the amount of spending that Nigeria was likely to see, even before the supplementary budget that would have allowed for a good, sound system of voter registration, things that were needed for the electoral reforms to be meaningful to take place. If we looked at the original 2010 budget, spending had been ramped up almost 50% year on year from last year. And that, of course, is excluding these big items that make the news headlines, such as the presidential jets. There is a bigger concern. 70% of Nigerians living on $1 a day, 90% perhaps living on $2 a day. There is a problem of poverty that hasn't been dealt with adequately enough, despite the fact that Nigeria, in overall terms, is still a wealthy country, enormously rich in both human capital, enormously rich in natural resources too. The wider question is about...
Yes, so what is the biggest hindrance? Is it corruption?
The problem is that there's a lot of spending that happens in Nigeria with very little to show for it. So one would suspect that there are serious governance concerns even so.
Razia Khan, thank you very much for joining us here on Counting the Cost. Philippine Airlines is struggling to stay in the air as its pilots leave for better paid jobs with richer carriers elsewhere in the world. The government has stepped in to try and ease the pain. But if Philippine Airlines can't find new pilots by October, regulations on the number of hours its pilots can fly could well ground the airline altogether. Margot Tigas has more.
Another clean landing for Philippine Airlines. But things haven't been going as smoothly for the national flag carrier off the tarmac.
It's like corporate slavery. We don't trust them anymore.
Captain Juan Santos says bad work conditions and worsening labor disputes led some 25 or so of his colleagues to resign recently en masse, seeking employment elsewhere. Santos stayed behind, at least for now, and hides his identity to protect his job.
To tell you honestly, we're working maximum for the past few months now. Even though before this exodus came, already working 90 to 100 hours a month. In a way, you can see it's to be unsafe because your crew is over fatigued.
International regulations stipulate pilots can fly a maximum 100 hours a month and no more than 1,000 hours a year. By October, most Philippine airline pilots would have reached their limits.
Our employees are not working above the normal working hours. No? We do take good care of our employees. We cannot cut costs in training. We cannot cut costs in maintenance. No? We cannot cut costs if it will affect the safety of the flights.
But Philippine Airlines has had to cut costs somewhere. It was affected by the global economic crisis and overtaken domestically by low-cost competition. Despite this, management says the 70-year-old company has survived worse and is already on its way back up.
Philippine Airlines is expected to beef up its fleet of aircraft in the next couple of years, and officials say they're in need of pilots. At present, they have some 450 on staff, but more are expected to leave in the next coming weeks.
Because of the rapid growth of air traffic in this part of the world, and also many airlines, they have been purchasing the new planes, new aircrafts. Therefore, we have been seeing that smaller airlines in this region, it would be very difficult for them to retain their experienced staff.
At this special flight school north of Manila, students come from around the world to train to become commercial pilots, taking advantage of the rising demand for ready-made captains. Airlines save money by not having to spend for training, and the pilots will sell their services to the highest bidder. In the end, it all comes down to economics. And for cash-strapped carriers like Philippine Airlines that stand to lose more of their crew in the coming days, unless a balance is found soon, might be forced to ground its fleet more permanently. Margo Ortigas, Al Jazeera, Manila.
And remember to check out Counting the Cost online. We've got plenty of material there, which you can get to from the programs link at aljazeera.net/English. We post entire episodes of the show there each week with a blog and special web-only links and content. You can also check out what time we're screening in your area each week. And if you're the tweeting type, at AJ Counting Cost is the name to look for. And that's it for this week. From me, Imran Garda, and the rest of the Counting the Cost team, bye-bye.